Today is August 13th, 2026, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong Motan. Every Thursday morning, Kim Best, Felicia Harris-Haas, Jean Lawler, David Schraga, and I are delighted to host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everybody who negotiates. As most people know, there's no charge for these great webinars. We ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And since we began the series in 2020, our audiences have been so generous in contributing to fight food insecurity in honor of our great speakers. One of my favorite parts of the program each week is when we announce the running total of just how much our audiences have contributed since we started the series. Kim, are you doing the honors today?
I do have the honor of this, so drum roll, please. The total to date now is $1,022,219.48. Thank you all for your generosity, and thank you to all the speakers for their generous gift of their time.
Wow, that is just amazing. Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you to all our speakers, and most of all to our generous audiences. Today we have another great presentation, How to Use Your Conflict Owner's Manual with Dr. Deborah Sword. Most conflict processes and teaching models use a step-by-step framework, starting with step 1. But what if there is an overlooked step 0? Whether you're a mediator, arbitrator, lawyer, or coach for professional or personal problems, chances are that step 1 is you identify the issue. But step 0 adds value with benefits that continue after the conflict process ends. Step 0 enhances reflective practice, deepens conflict analyses, and offers the potential to expand both the services you offer your clients and use in daily life. During today's session, attendees will think about how we think about step 0, which we may pin on our own unique conflict mental map. We have a terrific presenter today, Dr. Deborah Sword, for a master's degree in conflict resolution and doctorate in conflict analysis. Deborah drew on interdisciplinary research to understand how parties think about their conflict while they experience it. The longer Deborah was a conflict manager, the more questions she had about conflict management practices. Step 1 in the teaching models and in the mediation or arbitration room felt like starting too late, while step 0 supports individuals' conflict competence. Deborah writes Substack posts and podcasts about the Conflict Owner's Manual, and she does most of her best thinking about conflict while on the lake in her kayak or while walking her dog. So really looking forward to this presentation. Dr. Deborah Sword, please tell us a little bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're in a position to do so. And then I guess we'll hear all about step 0 starting at square 1, or maybe at square 0, wherever
Where's
you'd
your
like to start. Dr. Sword, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I want to talk about the Calgary Food Bank because I was on the call when Natalie presented and we hit $1 million, and I was just so inspired by that. And Calgary, Alberta, Canada, is one of the industrial basis for the oil and gas industry. So there's a belief that it's quite wealthy, but there's also a lot of people in need. So if anybody is inspired to give, I would be most appreciative. And American dollars go much farther in Canada. So it's a generous group, and I appreciate that. So thank you, everyone, for coming. And shall I just jump into it then?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So it's no surprise that people have ideas about how life should be conducted, about what's fair and whose rules to follow. And I hope that people will share their thoughts in the chat or and that the moderators will tell me if there are any questions or thoughts, because I will be posing questions. You probably have had this experience that you're in a meeting or in a mediation, and there's somebody, let's call them Stubborn Sam. And Sam has a very strong belief about how conflict should be conducted, about how people should behave, about how they should treat others. And what I began to observe in mediation was that what Sam believed flowed into how Sam behaved. And this got their beliefs pinned to their conflict mental map, and everything that how they conducted themselves became part of their belief system. And then they became judgmental, and we observed them as stubborn. But what they were doing made sense to them. And I began to wonder what Sam was thinking of. What was the origin of Sam's thought processes? And I did a public workshop called Your Conflict Mental Map. It became my most popular workshop. I wanted a way to organize my observations that what we believe is how we behave. And there's so much research to back this up. For example, seniors who don't believe that aging means declining health actually age better and live longer than seniors who believe that aging means that you just decline into decrepitude. So I looked for a model that applied thinking about conflict to our work. And that's the model I want to share with you today. And hopefully you'll personalize it and use it the way you want. I call it Step Zero of the Conflict Owner's Manual. So what is Step Zero and why should you care? Our belief, one of our core principles in mediation or conflict resolution, is to not rush to solutions. But are we applying that to our processes when step one is usually to immediately identify the problem and the issues? So, step zero is to think with clients or with your own self how you think generally, to reveal your beliefs and your patterns and the origins of your beliefs, and then to apply that, to transfer that to conflict, but to start first with your beliefs. So a step zero will actually expand the ruts in people's brains, and it primes them for step one when we ask them to think about their conflict and how it might be resolved. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll show you some ways I use my conflict owner's manual, and hopefully we can have a discussion about how you can personalize yours. Mine begins with questions. So if you think about how training often starts, we ask for definitions of conflict. So you're in a class or you're training and you introduce yourself to the new attendees and you say, so how do you define conflict, or how do you think about conflict? And people will give synonyms. They'll say fight, argument. Then they'll get to feelings. It's stress, disappointment. And then someone will say, it's creativity, it's growth, it's insights. And I began to ask, but where do you go with those positives? When is conflict positive? For how long? Positive for who? In what ways? And who decides? My answers came from thinking based on my beliefs in my conflict owner's manual. So I put it in the tab under marketing. I believe that conflict can be positive, and that's one of the features that I market. And then I cross-reference it with impasse, how to quit. Do I impose a marathon mediation, keeping people at the table long past the time when it was positive for them? Thank you for your patience with me. So let's go back to the rut in our brains. They become tracks where we cycle around ruminating about our problems when we fixate on something. And if you've mediated, you've had perhaps that stubborn Sam, that person who's stuck on thoughts and beliefs and behavior. So think about a mediation you've had. Was there a stubborn Sam in it? Or maybe an employee in a meeting? That behavior was pinned on their conflict mental map, and they approach that problem or that conflict in terms of that stubborn belief of how conflict should be conducted. And they are judging everybody who doesn't agree with them. So, what do you do with that person when somebody asks me the right way to conduct conflict, or when Stan says that's not the right way? I'm not going to settle until that person does the following. And I will say, well, it depends. That's our standard. It depends. But what do you say after it depends? Again, I would love to hear what your ideas are. What do you say with a stubborn Sam after you say it depends? So this, it may be obvious to us, but it very seldom is to my clients. When I'm doing preparations to mediate I'm mapping the conflict in terms of the parties and the power structures, who has authority to decide, the context, the issues, and the situational factors, and so on. I'm thinking about the mental maps of the shortcuts, because those conflict mental maps are the scripts. They form the patterns. So if I have the privilege of meeting with the clients beforehand, and I generally try to, my preparation includes asking about their thinking in general, to get them comfortable with thinking about conflict in general, to think about the rut they're in. I can't change their beliefs, but I can perhaps guide their walk over their conflict mental map, looking for opportunities to expand their point of view. So, one of the questions I ask is, well, where did that thought originate? Where does your thinking about conflict come from? I'm not challenging their point of view or their idea about conflict, but I'm asking them to think what shortcuts their brain takes when they're in a conflict pattern and what scripts they might follow. So again, in the chat, if you would, what are some questions you can think of that expand your thinking or people's thinking in general?
Deborah, I've got a question for you. What sort of answer comes back when you ask that type of question? Is it a historical experience? Is it specific about their upbringing or about a specific dispute they've been in or part of the relationship with the other party?
That's a great question. And I'm not a therapist, so I'm not getting into, uh, tell me about your fears, but it's very often fear-based, fear of being taken advantage of. They'll tell me an experience they had that they swore was never going to happen to them again. And one of the questions I ask is, so tell me which of these expressions makes the most sense to you. I always give people a second chance, or nobody gets a second chance with me. Which makes sense to you? And people will tell me about that, and I say, okay, tell me why. Not what are your reasons for believing that? And again, if you by being non-confrontational, but with real curiosity and interest in their thinking about their thinking, they will tell me their story. I might never get them to embrace the idea of change. I'm not trying to, but I'm enlarging the rut so that when we go into the mediation and get to step one and the steps after, there's a possibility that something we said in their thinking about thinking will come back to them and potentially enlarge the rut that they're in. So they're not cycling around that rumination that nobody will be able to take advantage of them ever again. They might be.
There's a comment in the chat as well. I didn't interrupt. There's a comment in the chat that might resonate as you talk about that cycling and rumination. Someone noted they say it sounds like you have a dilemma, and it depends on how you want to address it. I imagine that's the same type of circular dynamic you experience.
Yes, and that's a great way of framing a question. And I would put that in my conflict mental map under observations and ways that I could word the question in the next time I run into a stubborn Sam. And I could also do this when I meet with the party who's meeting with the stubborn Sam if it was an employer and ask that question of the employer. It sounds like you have a dilemma with this employee.
Another question comes up that might be useful. It's been asked, what are some real examples from your mediation? So you were just talking about an employment situation. Is there some sort of specific examples where you've seen this play out?
Absolutely. Thank you. Actually, it was with a law society, and I say that specifically so that people get the framework that it's in a legal situation. So one of the parties were all lawyers, and they had very strong ideas, and there was a change that was expected. I'm not going to go into details, obviously, for confidentiality. But one of the people kept saying, but I don't want you to just accept the change. I want you to embrace it. I didn't understand what that meant. And I was pretty sure that the employee who was being chastised wouldn't understand it. So I called for a break. And let's go back to step zero, I said with the employee. What does it mean? What does it mean to you and to how you approach your work that your employer is asking you to embrace this? What does that mean to you? And a whole story came up about losing control. And I think my job is in jeopardy, and I know what my skill set is. And if I try this, I'm afraid I'm going to fail. Then I could bring the parties back together and say, can we start step one again? Let's talk about how you're going to support the change, because that hadn't come up.
Great,
I hope.
great example. Great example.
Any other comments or questions? Thoughts? While you're thinking about thinking, I'll keep going. So here's an insight into how my thinking about conflict. So my father was a great fan of Jim Thorpe, who was one of the best athletes of the 20th century. I heard about him in the 1960s because, yes, I've earned all this gray hair. But he was an athlete in 1912. And I heard the story of his mental preparation, as I say, in the 60s. He visualized, mentally rehearsed, and talked himself into winning. Okay, so think that was 1912. Sports psychology didn't become a thing until the 1920s. In 1992, the movie A Few Good Men came out, and I normally dislike lawyer movies and TV shows, but I make an exception for A Few Good Men, and I've watched it about a dozen times, and I'm going to show you a scene from it. Then I encountered Donald Wood's article in 1997. Dr. Woods did a 25-year research project at McGill University in Montreal and shared his findings. And most conflict trainers use variations of this model. I use it on myself and when I'm doing training. And it forms a large part of my thinking about conflict. And then Carol Dweck came up with the book Mindset, and I became really interested in the kinds of questions that change mindsets more than facts and arguments. And I began looking at questions that we can ask ourselves and our clients about our mindsets. Again, thinking about our thinking and enlarging the ruts that we're in, expanding them. Danny Early in 2010 did a wonderful book called Predictably Irrational, with lots of thoughts about thinking. And of course, I'm never irrational. I make perfect sense all the time, and you can just ask my partner about that. I'm sure he'll agree with me. There are many in this field who are looking at and working with conflict mental maps. I'm quite partial to Heidi and Guy Burgess and Tammy Lenski. And our own Kim Best talks about maps as foundational. And I'm very much looking forward to her talk in 2 weeks. So are we using all of the opportunities we have and all the ways we could to think about our thinking? Step 0 applies to our processes, whether we're coaching or mediating for stuck clients or in training, and then to our civic life and to ourselves. So let's look at how we can expand our viewpoint in step 0. This is the scene from A Few Good Men.
Do you have any other questions for me, counselor?
Lieutenant Kathy. Lieutenant, do you have anything further for this witness?
Thanks, Danny. I love Washington.
Excuse me. I need to dismiss you.
I beg your pardon.
I'm not through with my examination. Sit down.
Colonel,
What's that?
I'd appreciate if you would address me as Colonel or Sir. I believe I've earned it.
Defense counsel will address the witness as Colonel or Sir.
I don't know what the hell kind of unit you're running here.
And the witness will address this court as Judge or Your Honor. I'm quite certain I've earned it. Take your seat, Colonel.
I'm very interested in and influenced by Ken Cloke and Michael Lang's focus on reflective practice. Can we please treat this scene as reflective practice for thinking about our thinking? I'll just leave Tom Cruise up there with his that gaze. So what was Tom Cruise thinking in this scene at the start? Or how about when the judge asked him to proceed? Again, unmute yourself or put your thoughts in the chat. And then when the jury's expressions revealed absolutely nothing, and when the men on trial for their lives didn't flinch when he looked at them, Demi Moore's gaze that drilled into his soul. Again, when Jack Nicholson got testy, when he drank from the water, or now when he's looking at his team. It's the same scene. Was he thinking the same thing at each point? Everyone had a thought, a different problem, a different interest, a different context. And there was always Tom Cruise thinking about all of them, thinking in his thinking and trying to make a decision. I know that I've had that experience when all eyes are in the meeting or the mediation or the training. Everybody's looking at me. They're waiting for me to say something, and I have no idea. What do you do?
It can feel excruciating at times to be in that circumstance.
So, what is the difference in our thinking about our thinking between, for example, Jim Thorpe training his brain to win, to rehearse, and the stubborn Sams, the ruminators, who are deepening the ruts in their brains? How do we think differently?
Deborah, maybe I could ask you, you mentioned, and maybe you could help us along, because I think probably all of us might be struggling in a sense to understand what the answer is here, because as you've noted, there's so many different perspectives on the answer to that question and what's going on in the room. You mentioned Ken Cloke's reflective practice, and what does that mean to you in the context of analyzing this scene and what's going on emotionally within the character?
First of all, I'm going to go back to something you said. We're all struggling with this, trying to get the answer. There is no one right answer. It is a moving target. That's why I asked, every single point in the scene brings up a different way of thinking about it. And if we don't look at the complexity of those changes, then we're always missing a part of the picture, part of our own thinking, and a part of our client's thinking, and a part of the moving power structures. Every single face had a different power. The judge, the jury, the men who were powerless, Jack Nicholson, who thought he had the power but would soon learn that he had none. This is the kind of analysis that we can do at step 0 if we're thinking about our thinking. It wasn't a trick question. It was the answer was in the moving questions.
There's
And
a comment, there's a comment in the chat that I think is interesting. It says, as a mediator, I guess potentially in a situation like this, Sam Wales says, I reflect on the possible ways to go. And one strategy he utilizes is to ask a question to break the silence if he doesn't come up with something, and waiting a long time potentially before speaking.
And what I agree with, that's beautifully put. And I'm going to add to it and say, sometimes that silence is the answer. Silence speaks volumes. And sometimes if you let the silence go on long enough, they're thinking too, just like the people attending are. They're thinking, I'm asked a question, what's the right answer? And maybe an original thought or an inspiration will come. We have a time limit, and I want to leave time at the end for a discussion. So we can't let the silence go on for too long. But if I had let it go on, then somebody would have said something, as you did, David, because we don't let silence go on. But the scene reflects how thinking changes, how it evolves with the parties in the room and the context.
And I'll just say there's one last comment here that maybe to close out this area, which is, thanks for the reminder to pause and think/wonder, to take the time to actually consider.
Thank you. In my Substack, I analyze fiction, and one of the headings I use is wonder. What do I wonder about in this scene? So yes, thank you. So that's the reason that I talk about Jim Thorpe and mindsets and predictable irrationality as milestones that I've pinned on my conflict mental map in my conflict owner's manual, is because those are the things that help me think about things in different ways. And these are the questions that we ask ourselves to prime our mindsets to be open and curious. So what's left for step 0 in practice? The first is we do conflict better personally when we think about our thinking. We are better conflict managers professionally when we recognize that the stubborn Sams are also doing this kind of thinking, but they may be stuck in a rut, and we can have the tools to help them expand their rut. And here's the additional gift. Just like my most popular public workshop is your conflict mental maps, this is an additional service you can offer to clients and others. Helping people think about their thinking is one of my income sources. So let's go on to the way of thinking that I'm particularly partial to, the McMaster.
Do you have any other?
Oh, this one, the McMaster Problem Solving Program. And I've put the citation in the on the slide. So when you look at the slide, please do look it up and read it. It's fairly academic, but Dr. Woods has been most generous. He's outlined step by step his model, and each module is outlined. So we know that problem solving and critical thinking are learnable skills. But what Dr. Woods found in his 25 years of research and recording of every class was that providing opportunities to resolve problems and watching others resolve problems did not develop people's problem-solving skills. So he did his course on problem-solving parallel to regular coursework. So he's in the engineering department, and he's trying to teach engineers to solve problems. They give them all the skills, and then he discovered that they could do exercises. If they memorized the steps, they could apply the steps as an exercise. But if they ran into a novel problem, one that didn't fit the regular frame, or where there were constraints, where there weren't enough resources, they couldn't transfer the skills. They couldn't think in novel situations to solve those problems. But he found that if he ran the problem-solving workshop parallel to regular coursework, teaching skills foundational to success, and I'm going, wait, that sounds like my step 0. So I got excited. What works, according to Dr. Woods, is what he called build, bridge, and extend. And it's an awful lot like how we train people to mediate, but he focused not on the core skills, but the transferability of the core skills, which got me really excited. And to me, it's another reflective framework to think about how I think about conflict. So he defines exercise as approaches that are memorized in accessible patterns, where you recall the steps, but you can't necessarily apply the steps to novel or surprising situations. Whereas a problem is a novel situation where you don't have enough resources or information that requires thinking by analogy to new applications of knowledge. And analogy is to think critically and solve novel problems based on what you do know, but to do it in different ways. So in the build stage, I ask clients to perform a skill independent of content. So how do you do a conversation? Just a regular conversation. How do you go into a coffee shop and order coffee? And then the Jim Thorpe method. Reflect on how you visualize that isolated skill, not in context of anything, not to transfer it to different content, just how did you do that? And then you bridge, you link the skill to a context, you place that conversational skill in a time, an environment, a relationship, your choice. And then you reflect on the process of transferring the skill, not the isolated skill, but the process of transferring it. How did you do that? Not to the context you placed it in. Forget about, I took it from this environment to this environment, but how did you take it? Did you carry it in a bucket? So you reflect on the transferring. And he called the build and the bridge the exercise stage, remembering that exercises are where you memorize, and then you just follow the memorized steps. And then you get to the extend stage. That's where you link the skill to every day. You look at your life, you look at your conflict, look at your problem, and you transfer whatever skill you were looking at to a complex and novel situation, because you're now dealing with the problem, not the exercise. You take the skill you built, you transfer it to the context you put it in, to a situation you don't recognize with constraints you don't have the resources to overcome. And then you reflect on the skill of transferring by thinking by analogy. How did I do that? What is that like? Remembering that analogy is to solve novel problems based on what you do know. So I don't know that, but I know how to do something like that. Are you with me so far? Any questions?
I think we're with you. I think the question I have is, for those of us who do maybe something like commercial mediations, is there an example or a framework that can offer to help us think about how to apply this to our actual mediation work?
There's a process in construction where you do you get together everybody who might be on the construction project. And the idea is that you get together with the subs, the contractors, the funders, uh, the project manager, and you come up with a general timeline so that there's no downtime. And I was retained to facilitate that because it was getting contentious. They couldn't agree. The funding was iffy. There was a problem with the project manager was difficult, the stubborn Sam of the project, and they really needed the project manager to get on board. And I mean, it's just a coincidence that these were builders and we're in the build stage. I went through the process with them, and it was really significant to deal with the transferring stage because they were doing a handoff to the subs. So their analogy was perfect. Oh, Deborah, when you're talking about us transferring, that's like when we do the handoff, when the framers are done and they're bringing in the electricians and they're handing off the plans. The analogy was perfect. It was like, I hate to use the cliche, the penny dropped. You could see their thinking shifted. They began to use this language instead of talking about, okay, you're going to come in and then we're going to project manage this. They started using the extend model language in their discussion. And they did it all in one meeting. It resonated so clearly with them. Now, would it work with the group of lawyers? I think it would, because I was using this, I wasn't using the language, but I was using the same level of thinking when I was talking to them. When I called for a step zero in that, when I broke them apart and said I want to meet with the employee first, I was using the build, bridge, extend model in my mind, even though I wasn't using the language with him because we just didn't have the time. It was like 15-minute caucus, if that. But I asked him a question: where are you now? What is it about your current job? What have you got that's transferable? What are you afraid of? So that was the 3 steps I was going through intuitively. But until you asked that, David, I hadn't thought that that's what I was doing. So thank you. You've just you okay. You just watched me extend. Nice. Thank you.
But it seems like it can really is an overlay to part of what we're often doing in mediations, which is trying to sort of unpack what the issue is, understand the interest behind the position. Some of this language I'm sure we're all familiar with.
That's right. And the value added of this step zero is you're bringing your clients along with you. You're giving them an expanded toolkit for them to think about their thinking in a new way. And that is their ability to transfer what they want to look at what they're being offered, if there is an offer, or if it's a stubborn Sam, to extend his thinking so that he can accept that there might be another way to look at it. It might never, a stubborn Sam might never get to the place where he or she or they can accept, but their own thinking can extend. And then once mediation is over, you don't know what that stubborn Sam takes out of the mediation that is going to change that person's life and potentially at some point in the future maybe make an offer to settle that is a direct outcome of your mediation, but just not in the mediation room. That person may have needed some time to process it, because that's what the transferring step does. It allows that person to expand their thinking.
Let me ask you this, Deborah. So, you talked about sort of maybe sometimes they're entrenched in a way where they really can't come along, or you reach this point of a potential impasse, and you recognize within this dynamic that they're stuck, and maybe you're not going to be able to get them to extend. What are the strategies that you utilize to pivot and try and sort of take that realization into moving towards a resolution potentially?
It depends. Our favorite. It depends. Is this a long-term relationship? Are you in an employment mediation where these two parties are going to have to work at the same in the same department in the future? Like starting tomorrow, is anything going to change for them? Or is this like the building situation where they're going to have to be on the same workplace? Because your strategy will change in each situation. If, for example, in the employment, I would have said, let's come back tomorrow and I'll work with the employee and the employer separately for the rest of the afternoon. So I had a 15-minute caucus, I would have asked for an hour. If it was the construction situation, I might have said, what have we agreed to so far? What do we still need to agree to? And who are the parties who need to stay in the room, and who are the parties who can leave? And then we'll come back tomorrow and sign off on what, if anything, changed. So again, thinking about your thinking gives you the flexibility to be able to offer this in all kinds of different ways because you're thinking by analogy. You have more than one tool in your toolkit.
How about if you're in the context of like, the all-day drama of a one-day mediation and you're working on a financial settlement, and you're kind of coming into this place of an impasse and you're going back and forth and you're talking to both rooms and you realize one room is just stuck and you're not going to be able to change how they're looking at things. Are there strategies to communicate that in the other room to help them adjust? How do you deal with that type of problem? Because as mediators, right, for those of us who do the commercial work, this is something that we're constantly navigating, people getting
And
stuck.
I'll tell you my big failure at doing that, and you can take a lesson from that. I didn't prime the room that was agreeable well enough. I knew that the problem room, I'll call them a problem room, the stubborn Sam room, I knew that they were the ones who needed the work. And so I said to the room that was agreeable, can I have some time with the other room and I will go and work with them because you're flexible, they're not. I'll go and work with them. So I went to work with them, but I didn't check in enough with the agreeable room, and they thought I was biased. I lost their trust because they thought I was spending too much time with the other room. So I offer that as a cautionary tale. Don't do what I did. I wouldn't do that again. I made a mistake. I own it. So what I would do is now is do the 3 steps together and try that. See if that works. And say, can't you know your clients? You know the industry you're working in. I would work with them and say, what's the analogy here? What you're trying to bridge this. What's that like? How would you work with that by analogy? If you were going to come to an agreement on this, how would you bridge from what you want, transfer that to what you want to have, and then how do you extend that? What's the analogy? How do you transfer? I would use the language. But you know your industry, you can find language that works for them. The same as I did with the lawyers. They weren't in, but the language was perfect for the builders and the construction industry, not so much for the lawyers. So, what's the language that would work for your industry? So, I hope that answered the
Yeah, no,
question.
it's very helpful. It's very helpful. It's a useful perspective to apply.
To know how I screwed up. Yeah. You don't do what I did.
Ah, I'm sure you do great.
It was a while ago. So when I talk about conflict mental maps, and again, it's my most popular workshop, I market it as conflict competence. So the conflict owner's manual, and I've bought the domain name conflict competence, I think in 1990, 91, or very early, because I saw conflict competence as the ultimate goal for this. We've got a familiar situation. This is an exercise. It's a familiar situation. It's a problem without surprises or constraints. You can visualize this. You know it's a familiar process. You're going to be okay. If there's a surprise, a novelty, or constraints, you risk being flummoxed. You don't know what to do because it's novel. So again, David, one of a partial answer to your question, it was novel for me. I was flummoxed. I was treating it like an exercise when it was really a problem. So the transferability comes when it's a novel situation. I didn't touch anything, but there are red lines appearing. Okay, a novel situation, a surprise, but not a problem. This is an exercise. So if it's a novel situation, but it's a problem with where you're competent, it's transferable. You can adapt and adjust, and you've got the curiosity. You ask the questions and you deal with the surprises and constraints. But when it's a problem with both surprise and constraints, then you've got analogous content. I don't know how to do this, but what can I do? And you're thinking about conflict competencies to apply them in novel situations. So the first thing you want to know, am I dealing with a problem or an exercise? Is this something I know how to do, or is this a novel situation I've never dealt with before? And if it's a novel situation, what is the analogy? What do I know that's like this? Or I may not have the resources or adequate information, but what do I know, and how can I bring my parties into this with their knowledge and their information? And that's what I should have done in the one where I didn't do a good job. I should have brought them together and said, what don't I know? So brains are pattern making machines. They anticipate, they fill in knowledge gaps with assumptions, and our assumptions are what we rely on. We pin them to our conflict mental map, and our conflict mental map is always running in the background. We need to make it explicit. See what I just did? We need to. Don't do that. I encourage you to make it explicit, to think about your thinking. So you've got a conflict owner's manual. Everybody has one. We just don't make it explicit, but it is directing our actions, our thoughts. And we can self-coach ourselves to an open mindset, to visualizing success, to accepting risk the way Tom Cruise did. And if you haven't watched A Few Good Men recently, do yourself a favor. Just watch Tom Cruise take a risk. He didn't know what he was doing, but he had the analogy and he follows through. Well, I don't know what Santiago did, but I know what you did. And I'm going to reason by analogy. And that's how he trapped the colonel. And we're primed for irrationality while we think we're being rational. So if you are interested in that and putting all of this together, then I suggest you're ready to go to step one. Questions, comments, please unmute yourself. I don't know how to get rid of that red line. I have no analogy. Does anybody have a suggestion?
I'm not sure I would know how to get rid of it either, but it's a fantastic program. It's a very useful framework to think about what we could carry into these mediations ourselves before we even get there.
And what we can do to extend it, which gives us more tools and the possibility of offering another service to our clients. We can make a workshop out of this. I did it. I get paid for it.
We have a question, Miss Shopper Grigo. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your
Yeah,
name
no,
correctly.
that's
Please go
good
ahead.
enough. I just have a question as to how you would apply your model, Deborah, to a family law situation. Let's say a parenting issue. If there's a mom gatekeeper, that's uncooperative in terms of providing, sorry, it usually is mothers, but um, to um, to dad in your step zero kind of methodology.
I would think that that would be classic for um, extending, because these are people who are going to be connected as long as they're alive. They're the perfect example for extending their thought process to get them out of that rut. They're deeply locked in patterns and scripts, I suspect. The same script keeps playing out again and again. And in my podcast, Conflict Owner's Manual, I talk a lot about scripts and how to change the script. And I'm using this model of bridging. What's the transferability? What is mom concerned about? What would make her life easier to not be a gatekeeper? How much energy is she extending trying to gatekeep? Remember, our brains use energy. That's why they take shortcuts. Her gatekeeping is her shortcut to do something. What? What is her thought? What is she thinking about when she's thinking about her conflict? Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, we use similar like we do a lot of conflict training with Bill Eddy and especially high conflict. Yeah, so we use a similar kind of, so that's why I was wondering if your step zero offers like a deeper dive into that. Because, and I think David mentioned earlier that what's behind the interest is that usually it's fear-based and usually it's a power dynamic. And in the separation where there's a loss of, a familiar family dynamic, clients tend to go to that to get to have leverage and to maintain some power.
So, first of all, I'm going to say that I'm a big fan of Bill and his work, and I wish he had been helping my family when I was growing up in a high conflict family. That would have been nice. Um, so, again, the transferability. Remember the example I gave. You have a conversation. What does a good conversation look like? Think, Mom, about a good conversation you had. What was the skill you used? And then how do you transfer that? So, mom probably wants a good conversation with her kid. Just a guess. Mom probably wants their dinner times not to be a battleground. Again, just a guess. So, what would happen if she were to visualize that? A good relationship and a peaceful dinner time. And then how would she transfer that? Again, just a guess. And while I'm talking about what a big fan I am of Bill Eddy, I see Kathy Bickmore is on the call, and I want to say what a great fan I am of hers, who taught me everything I know about conflict. Thank you, Kathy. Kathy was my PhD supervisor, and I would not have gone anywhere without her. So does that help in the family situation? You're looking at, remember the build, stage, and the bridge stage, the extend stage, there's the liminal space where you walk across the bridge. That's what you want to get to. How do you do that?
Uh, Deborah, I'll just jump in and say, one thing that resonates with me is that when you talk about this situation with the mom and her family, what does a nice dinner look like? It's not just about what does it look like in terms of how does that conversation happen, but what really occurs to me is that there's an underlying feeling that's captured in that sentiment or that moment as well. And I'm not a family law mediator, but a good friend of mine is a family lawyer, and he told me a story about a mediation he was in with a mediator who did something extraordinarily powerful, which was I think the mediator was a woman, and she sat the parties across the table from each other, the husband and the wife, in the beginning of the mediation, and she says, "I know this is not particularly traditional, but I'm going to ask you to trust me with something," and she asked them to close their eyes and to to first visualize what it was like when they first met each other, and then to visualize their wedding day together, and then to visualize the day that their first child was born, and then to visualize that moment in time where they knew that there was no saving the marriage, and then to open their eyes and look at each other and ask themselves, are you ready today to move on and to put this pain and conflict behind you? And so when you talk about that emotional feeling, it just made me think of that story as sort of going back to building on that emotional foundation within conflicts.
Nice. Yeah, just like I'm inspired by Jim Thorpe, the visualization, we use it all the time in our planning for our lives as well, not just at the moment of pain or the moment of conflict. We use it all the time. How do we transfer that? So the next time you're having a visualization, gee, it would be really nice to do X. I think I'm going to make it happen. Wait, that's a transferable skill. So there's a question. Now I can see the questions. Can you use a step 0 at any time during the arc of the conflict episode, or mainly to get started or to get through the stuck places? I'm going to suggest that once you're thinking about your thinking about conflict, or thinking about your thinking about a relationship, once you train your brain, you're not going to stop using it anytime. It is going to become a part of how you conduct your daily life. That's why I'm suggesting that as well as using this in our work, ask ourselves the questions. It's part of our reflective practice. And I have stopped a process to go back to step 0 and say, let's take a breather and think about how we think about this. So yes, I use it all the time. But particularly when I'm starting something, I will make it part of my map of the process. And then I'll try to see how the parties who are going to be in the process also map their thinking. And it really does help me facilitate whatever process I'm using.
These are fabulous insights, Deborah. Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We could go on with the discussion of this for quite a long time, deepening the insights. There's really a lot here. Thank you so much for a terrific presentation. I know that I'll be contributing to the Calgary Food Bank in your honor, and I hope that many others do as well. There's a link in the chat section to the Calgary Food Bank. Dr. Deborah Sword from Calgary, Canada, thank you so much again for a terrific presentation. And with that, we are complete.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to meet with you.
You're very welcome.